The glass plaza of Olaro Spire gleamed under the harsh light of midday, its mirrored surface polished so perfectly that the sky itself seemed captured beneath the feet of those who crossed it. Orange daylight bled down the flanks of the towers, bouncing from one steel-lined wall to another until the entire space pulsed with a sterile glow. Screens lined the walkways, flickering with biometric tags and shifting price tallies, turning every human shape that passed into data and digits. At the center of the plaza stood the stage, a raised platform of transparent crystal where women were presented not as people, but as inventory. Sarai stood at its heart, her copper hair tangled around her face, damp from the drizzle that had passed earlier, strands catching the light like tarnished metal. At 24, she was in the prime of life, yet her skin green with faint golden undertones that marked her Zairi Allen heritage was branded by whispers of flaw. A translucent wrap clung to her frame, knotted at the chest and hip, more curtain than clothing, and the anklets at her feet chimed whenever she shifted her weight. Each chime betrayed her limp, the old injury from a fall months ago that had never healed properly. To the buyers, it was a flaw. To her, it was a sentence. The first buyer approached with the detached scrutiny of a collector eyeing a cracked vase. He lifted her chin, forcing her gaze upward, muttered, "Too quiet," and released her as if silence itself was a defect. The second circled, his eyes narrowing at the way her steps faltered. His voice sharp in dismissal. "Limp. Won't last." The third watched her for less than a heartbeat before stepping back, pronouncing with cold finality, "No spark." She'd just sit there. By the fourth and fifth, she had stopped expecting anything else, their faces blurring into the same indifferent stare. By the sixth, her chest felt as if it had been bound tight, each rejection another knot pulled fast. When the seventh gave the same judgment, his lip curling with disdain at her quiet, Sarai lowered her eyes, the ache in her ankle flaring as she tried to shift out of his reach. She could feel the word hovering on every tongue, whispering through the crowd as surely as the chimes of her anklets. Broken, her throat burned. The mirrored plaza magnified everything, the sneers, the stares, the way even the sunlight seemed to spotlight her failure. She thought of what would follow, the handler's grip dragging her behind the rail, the storage cells where the air smelled of rust and recycled breath, the rations cut again and again until weakness made her irrelevant. She thought of the spiral she had seen others fall into, the slow descent into being discarded entirely. She kept her eyes low, praying for invisibility. But the handler was already reaching for her arm, his expression soured with the irritation of wasted time. The weight of inevitability pressed down until her knees nearly buckled. Then the voice came. Calm, steady, absolute. "I'll take her." It wasn't loud, not shouted to claim attention, but it cut through the plaza like a blade through fog. Heads turned, buyers stiffened. At the edge of the platform stood a man in a black coat, rain stains marking its seams, dark hair cropped close to his head. Broad-shouldered, upright, his presence carried weight without effort. People moved aside instinctively, as if the air around him demanded space. Darien Holt, human, age 36, former combat medic during the Frontier Wars, now hydroponics auditor bound to Olaro Spire. His gaze held no hunger, no appraisal. He had seen too many bodies cast aside as non-functional, too many lives dismissed as waste. He stepped forward, boots striking the glass with deliberate rhythm. The handler opened his mouth to protest, to list the terms and conditions, but Darian's voice came again, steady as stone. "No terms. Release her." Sarai froze, her heart hammering. She did not understand why the human had spoken, why his eyes fixed on her lacked the gleam she had come to fear. Yet the crowd shifted, murmuring, as the handler hesitated under the weight of that certainty. for the first time since the anklets had been locked around her ankles. Sarai felt the axis of her world tilt not into safety, not yet, but into something new. Something she could not name. The plaza emptied behind them in murmurs and sidelong stares, as Sarai followed the human who had spoken for her. The handler had scanned his wrist, the console flashing green, a receipt curling unnoticed to the floor, but the transaction had not felt like the others. No bargain, no list of duties or disclaimers, only that flat refusal of terms. Darien Holt's coat still hung from her shoulders, heavy with warmth, carrying the scent of rain and something faintly metallic, like old machinery. Each step across the polished expanse felt unreal, her bare feet sliding against glass that reflected her limp back at her. She half expected the handler to snatch her arm, to call her back, to say there had been a mistake. But the man in the black coat never slowed. His stride was measured, not hurried, not flaunting, simply steady. People parted without being asked, as though his presence alone cut a path. When the lift doors closed behind them, silence pressed in. The walls mirrored their reflections, steel brushed to a muted sheen. Darien watched the numbers climb, his eyes not once flicking toward her. Sarai's heart pounded harder than it had on the stage. She had been paraded before hundreds, stripped of dignity under fluorescent lights, but the quiet beside this man unsettled her more. Not because it was cruel, but because it wasn't. Cruelty she understood sharp orders, smirks, the coldness of calculation. This stillness had no pattern she recognized. She clutched the coat tighter, her mind chasing questions she didn't dare voice. What did he want from her? What would he demand once the door opened? Why choose her when 7 others had already rejected her as waste? The corridor outside was pale and narrow, lined with soft-lit panels and the constant hum of the ventilation system. Darien stepped out without hesitation, boots striking each tile with the same calm rhythm. Sarai limped after him, her anklets chiming faintly until she realized no, there were no anklets anymore. They had slipped from her when she climbed down from the stage. She touched her bare ankle in disbelief, still red-marked, but free. Her chest tightened, unsure if it was relief or fear. At his unit door, Darien pressed his palm against the lock. A green light blinked, and the door slid open with a hush. Inside, the space was plain to the point of austerity. A single couch lined the wall, a low table scratched from use, 2 stools, a narrow kitchenette with white cabinets, an unlit induction plate. Beyond the half wall stood a bed, sheets tucked sharp, balcony glass framing the towers outside, where drizzle streaked neon into liquid threads. It was not luxury. It was not barren. It was simply lived in. Sarai hesitated at the threshold, clutching the coat like a shield. This was the moment. This was when demands would come. Obedience, service. She braced for it. But Darien only crossed the room, setting his key card on the counter, scanning the vents as though checking airflow. "Go in," he said simply, not glancing back. His voice carried no edge of command, no hunger, no heat. Just quiet certainty. Her throat tightened, confusion rising. She stepped inside. The door sealed behind her with a muted click. Darien turned then, studying her shaking hands as they gripped the fabric. "You're cold," he said. She nearly denied it, but the truth slipped free. "I am." He adjusted the heater vent, the hum growing faintly warmer. "Wash first," he said. "Bathrooms there. Towels on the rack. Shirts on the counter." His tone was steady, practical, like listing checks on a routine inspection. Without waiting for her reply, he filled a pot with water, the sound of running tap startling in its ordinariness. Steam began to rise, the smell of mineral-rich liquid filling the small unit. Sarai stared at his back, her chest nodding. Every motion he made carried a precision that reminded her of the way a medic might dress a wound, not rushed, not careless, but deliberate. She half expected him to turn suddenly, to reveal the hidden cost in his eyes. Yet he did not. He only set the pot on the induction plate, adjusting the heat, moving with practiced calm. For the first time in years, Sarah realized she had not been ordered, not been assessed, not been reduced to silence. She had been given instructions meant for comfort, not control. Her breath shuddered out. She slipped into the bathroom, locking the door behind her, and stood beneath the harsh light. The translucent wrap fell from her body into the bin, the last symbol of display discarded. The steel anklets were gone. For the first time in months, she stood unclothed without being inspected. The shower hissed, warm water striking her shoulders. It was not recycled trickle, not rationed drops, but a steady flow. She leaned against the tile, letting it drum against her skin until her pulse slowed. When she emerged, damp hair clinging to her back, Darien had set 2 bowls on the table, steam rising in fragrant swirls. He gestured to the stool with a slight tilt of his head. "Eat," he said, as if it were the most natural word in the world. Her fingers tightened on the coat around her shoulders. For the first time, she could not tell if the knot in her chest was fear or the first flicker of something dangerously close to hope. Night settled over Ilaro's spire in restless patterns of rain and neon, the city's hum seeping faintly through the balcony glass. Sarai sat stiffly on the edge of the bed, the coat still wrapped around her shoulders, as though it alone kept her from unraveling. The bowls had been emptied herbs, mushrooms, broth that had burned her tongue and then warmed her chest in a way she had not expected. Darien had eaten with the same deliberate rhythm as he did everything else, his eyes never fixed on her but on his own bowl, as if giving her space was as natural to him as breathing. When the dishes were rinsed and stacked neatly, he pulled a blanket from the shelf and spread it across the couch. "Bed's yours," he said, tone flat but final. She blinked at him, caught off guard, stammered that she could take the floor. His reply carried the weight of a medic's diagnosis. "You won't." There was no argument to make. His voice was not cruel, not indulgent, only certain, and it left her more unsettled than command ever had. She lay down in the bed, the sheets clean, the balcony lights filtering pale streaks across the walls, while Darien stretched on the couch beyond the half wall. Back to her, boots set neatly aside, coat folded within arm's reach. The city buzzed. His breathing evened. For the first time in months, her eyelids lowered without dread choking her throat. Sleep did not come easily, but it came. Morning light seeped in muted bands, streaking the glass with silver lines where rain had dried. Sarai stirred, the coat still bundled to her chest, her body heavy not from fear, but from something stranger rest. Darien was already awake, sitting at the table, his black coat draped across his knees as he repaired a seam with slow, practiced stitches. He glanced up, his eyes steady, voice low. "You slept without holding it all night." She blinked, realizing the coat had slipped toward her feet sometime in the dark. A faint smile touched her lips before she could stop it. He set the glove aside and moved to the kitchenette, the hiss of the kettle filling the silence. 2 mugs of coffee steamed a bitter scent into the air. He placed one before her. "Drink, it helps wake you." She wrapped her hands around the ceramic, the heat seeping into her palms, grounding her in the moment. No one had ever offered her such simple normalcy without demand. It terrified her more than cruelty ever had. Her ankle throbbed when she shifted to stand, the old injury flaring in protest. Darien noticed immediately, his gaze sharp, not prying but clinical. "Let me look." She stiffened. "Why?" "Because you limped yesterday." "It's swollen." "It'll worsen if left." Reluctantly, she extended her leg. His hands were large, roughened by work, yet precise. He pressed along the tendon with measured care, listening for her hiss of pain, nodding once when he found the tender point. Old injury? She admitted it had been months. They said it would heal. He shook his head slightly, not dismissive, but with the certainty of one who had seen worse. He applied a cooling gel that numbed the burn, then wrapped her ankle in steady layers of tape, explaining each step: rest, gel, compression, elevation. You'll do this yourself next time. It's your body. The words struck deeper than she expected. No one had ever said that to her before. For years, her body had been treated as inventory, performance, defect. Now it was hers, again because he said so. She swallowed hard, unable to answer, only nodding as he secured the final strip. Better? He asked. She tested her weight. The pain dulled to something manageable. Better, she whispered. He nodded once, as though confirmation was enough. He cleared the table, the motion steady, routine, and she watched him with wary eyes. Why me? She asked at last, the question that had sat like a stone in her chest since the plaza. He set the bowl down, turned, and met her gaze without hesitation. Because they called you broken, and you aren't. Her breath caught. She clutched the coat tighter. You don't know that. He shook his head once. I've seen broken. His tone carried the weight of collapsed bunkers, of blood and silence. He did not speak aloud. You're not. She looked down quickly, afraid of the hope rising in her throat. A dangerous thing to believe in this city. Darien glanced at the wall clock, pulling his coat on. I audit hydroponics in the mornings. It'll take a few hours. I'll be walking the bays. If you want to come, you can. If not, you'll be safe here. She froze at the word. Safe, foreign, heavy. Her fingers tightened on the mug. He had given her a choice, unforced, unbartered. She could not remember the last time choice had been offered to her. She stared at him, heart pounding with something closer to fear than relief. He adjusted the strap of his tablet, turned toward the door. Decide before we reach the sky bridge, he said calmly. And then he waited, not with impatience, but with the patience of someone who knew choice meant nothing if it was rushed. Sarai sat in silence, every breath a battle. Perhaps this was another trap, patience only another chain. But perhaps it was not. She lifted the plain clothes folded neatly on the shelf, and in the quiet of the unit, for the first time in years, she realized the decision was hers. The sky bridge stretched between towers, like a ribbon of glass and steel suspended above the city's depths, its surface slick with last night's rain. Below, the underlevels churned with the endless hum of transports, neon pulses bleeding through the haze. Sarai walked close to Darien, the gray jacket he had given her buttoned high at the throat, trousers soft against her skin, hiding the angles of her body. The simple change startled her, how different the world looked when she was not draped in a wrap meant for scrutiny. For the first time, the glances that slid her way carried no sharp edge, no whisper of judgment. People moved past with the indifference of routine, and that indifference felt like a gift. Darien's stride was measured, adjusted for her limp, yet unbroken in rhythm. He carried his tablet tucked under one arm, his posture upright, presence steady, the way of a man who knew his direction long before he stepped onto the bridge. She studied him in stolen glances, unsettled not by his silence, but by the lack of expectation in it. He walked beside her, not ahead to drag her, not behind to press her, but beside. The thought dug under her skin, unfamiliar and dangerous dot at the hydroponics bay. The doors parted with a sterile hiss, releasing a rush of humid air thick with the scent of minerals and wet leaves. Rows of nutrient towers rose like luminous spires, each one dripping with trailing roots suspended in clear water, their leaves glowing faintly under strips of artificial daylight. The chamber hummed with pumps and circulators, a rhythm like the pulse of a living heart. Darien stepped inside without pause, his eyes sweeping over gauges and flow meters with the same precision she had seen in his stitching and taping. "This is what I keep alive," he said, tapping his tablet awake. Graphs flickered, numbers scrolled, the lifeblood of the city made visible in decimals and alerts. Water flow, pH balance, conductivity. If it drifts, everything fails. People don't eat. His words were matter-of-fact, unembellished. He began moving down the rows, pausing to press a valve here, adjust a drip there, his motions precise and sure. Sarai followed, her limp soft against the wet tile. She found herself staring up at the towers, their green abundance overwhelming. They did not look at her. They did not whisper broken. Their leaves swayed in the currents, uncaring of her silence. She stopped near one line of bubbles rising through a tube, frowning. "That one," she murmured before she thought better of speaking. Darien crouched without hesitation, checked the valve, tapped the side until the bubbles quickened to match the others. He looked up at her, eyes steady. Good eye. Flow was weak. She blinked, her chest tight. No one had ever acknowledged her observation, not in the cells, not on the stage, not in the years before. Silence had always been her sentence. Here, it had weight. He stood, adjusted his tablet, moved on. For the next hour he explained only what was needed, how to read a nutrient chart, how the clarity of water revealed balance, how to listen for the rhythm of pumps. She listened, each word sinking into her with a clarity she had not expected. He did not overload her, did not patronize, did not treat her curiosity as waste. When she stumbled over numbers, he corrected without scorn. When she hesitated, he waited. For the first time in memory, her silence was not failure. It was space to notice Dot by the time they reached the end of the row. Her ankle throbbed from the walk, but the ache felt different-termed, not inflicted. Darien leaned against a railing, arms crossed, eyes on the endless rise of towers. His voice came steady, quiet. "You asked why I chose you." She froze, the words pressing sharp in her chest. He looked at her without flinching. Maybe it wasn't only because they called you broken. Maybe it was because you weren't pretending. She stiffened, heat climbing her neck. The others on the stage had smiled, flattered, begged. She had stood still, silent, waiting for the inevitable rejection. "You didn't act," he continued. "You didn't hide. That's not broken. That's honest." Her breath caught. Shame and hope twisted tight inside her. The world had called her defective for the same thing he now named strength. She turned away, staring at the endless green, afraid he might see too much in her face. The pumps hummed on, steady, indifferent. Yet within their rhythm, something shifted. The weight of silence no longer crushed her chest. It pressed outward, making space for something else. Fragile, but real. As they walked back toward the bridge, the city outside seemed less like a prison of mirrors, and more like a place she might learn to stand in. She still felt the eyes of strangers, but their whispers no longer struck as deep. Beside her, Darien's stride was unhurried, his presence steady. And for the first time since the word broken had been spoken over her, she felt a flicker of possibility that it might no longer define her. The next morning broke clear and sharp, sunlight spilling across the towers and cutting pale beams through the balcony glass. Sarai woke slowly, the gray jacket still wrapped around her shoulders, her body heavy, but not with dread only, the unfamiliar weight of rest. Darien was already moving with his usual precision, sealing a seam on his work gloves, the hiss of the kettle filling the silence. He glanced over, a faint nod acknowledging her presence, then poured 2 mugs of coffee. "Today we walk the market," he said simply, as if it were a task as ordinary as checking the pumps. Her stomach tightened at the thought. The market meant eyes, whispers, the stage echoing in her mind. She gripped the coat tighter, ready to refuse, but his voice stayed steady, without force. You've walked the bridges unseen. Now it's time to walk seen. If it's too much, I'll be beside you. The certainty in his tone left no room for argument, yet no trace of command. It was an invitation, nothing more. They left together, the sky bridge arching high above the city's currents. This time Sarai's stride was steadier, her ankles supported by careful tape, her frame clothed in plain gray trousers and jacket. She kept expecting the eyes of passers-by to pin her down, to strip her quiet bare, but the glances slid past, indifferent. The absence of stares left her dizzy, unmoored. Darien walked at his same calm pace, tablet under one arm, his coat brushing against hers with each step. At first she stayed close for cover, but as they moved further, she realized the cover wasn't needed. He didn't slow, didn't shield her deliberately, didn't use her as display. He walked with her, not because she was invisible, but because he refused to let the whispers define them. She found herself matching his rhythm, the fear still present, but dulled by the steadiness at her side. The market was alive with sound voices haggling. Transport drones humming above, the metallic clatter of crates being unloaded. Stalls stretched under awnings, their goods spilling into neat arrays. Bread rounds, root vegetables, cloth dyed in muted tones. Darien led her to one where clothing hung in clean rows. He stopped, stepped aside, and gestured toward the racks. Pick what you want. Sarai froze, pulse surging. No one had ever asked her that before. Clothing had always been issued uniforms, wraps, tokens of display. Choice had never entered into it. Her hands hovered uncertainly, afraid to reach, afraid of the weight of decision. She glanced back at him, but he only waited, eyes steady, no pressure in them. Slowly, she touched a slate blue shirt, soft under her fingers, plain but strong. Beside it, a simple dark skirt. Her throat tightened as she lifted them, half expecting him to frown at the cost. He didn't even ask the price. He paid without looking. Walking back, she felt her shoulders lift unconsciously. The clothes pressed to her chest, the city's noise no longer gnawing quite so deep. Darienne's pace was the same, calm and measured, but now she found herself matching it, not out of fear, but because she wanted to. The bridge stretched before them, glass gleaming under the sun, and for once the reflection staring back at her did not look like a figure marked defective. It looked like someone walking beside a man who did not care for whispers. That evening, steam rose from bowls of root stew thickened with grain, mushrooms grilled and fragrant. Sarai ate without hesitation, her spoon steady, and when she looked up, Darien was watching her, not evaluative, not hungry, but present. "You're not the same woman I found on that stage," he said. Her breath caught, the spoon pausing mid-her. She lowered her gaze. "I thought I was broken." His reply was quiet, absolute. "You never were." The words struck harder than she wanted to admit. She lifted her head, meeting his eyes, searching for the hidden demand. The cost she feared must come. There was none. Only plain truth in his steady gaze. "Then what am I?" She whispered. Darien leaned forward, his presence filling the small room, not with force, but with certainty. "You're the woman I want beside me. Not because you owe me, because I want it." Her hands trembled against the coat still draped over her shoulders. Heat climbed her neck, a weight of fear battling with something far more fragile. Relief. For a moment she could not speak, afraid belief itself might break her. But the silence stretched, steady and unbroken, and in it she found her voice. "I want to stay," she whispered. His gaze did not shift. "With me?" She nodded, her breath shaking. "You already are," he said. The words landed like a seal, not chain, but anchor. That night, as rain tapped softly against the glass and the city hummed beyond, Sarai lay down not as someone carried from a stage, but as someone who had chosen to remain. And for the first time since the word broken had marked her, she felt its grip begin to loosen. Rain streaked silver lines down the balcony glass. The city below alive with neon currents and the low hum of transit engines. But within the unit, the air was quieter than it had ever been. Sarai stood near the bed, the slate blue shirt and dark skirt she had chosen folded neatly on the chair, the gray jacket still wrapped around her shoulders like a tether to the moment everything had changed. Dinner dishes sat rinsed on the counter, steam still faint on their edges, and Darien leaned against the wall, arms crossed, his gaze steady but not pressing. For a long while neither spoke. The silence was not heavy, not the silence of judgment she had known, but something else room to breathe, to decide. Sarai's chest tightened with the weight of it. Choice still frightened her, but the absence of demand frightened her more. Finally she drew in a breath, her voice soft but unwavering. I want to stay. Not because I owe you. Because I want this. Her fingers trembled where they gripped the edge of the coat. Her pulse loud in her ears, but her words did not falter. Darien pushed away from the wall and stepped closer. Slow, deliberate, his presence filling the small room without swallowing her space. He stopped just short of a reach, his voice low, even. Then we do this together. On your terms, always. The words fell into the silence like stone into water, rippling outward, breaking the last of the fear that had clung to her since the plaza. She reached for him, her hand catching the fabric of his coat at the chest, pulling him down until their mouths met in a kiss that was hesitant only for a heartbeat, then steady, certain. The city's hum and the patter of rain blurred into the background as the distance between them closed. When they finally pulled apart, their foreheads rested together, breath mingling, the truth of what she had chosen too sharp to deny. For the first time since the anklets had been locked to her feet, she did not feel bound. She felt anchored. That night the bed was not hers alone. They lay side by side, the coat folded at the foot, their bodies close but unhurried, the city lights painting faint lines across their faces. Sarai curled into him, not with fear of being abandoned, but with the quiet certainty of belonging. Sleep came without resistance, carried on the steady rhythm of his heartbeat under her ear. When morning broke pale and clean, sunlight washing the towers until they gleamed, she woke to find herself still in his arms, not trapped but chosen. Her chest lifted with a breath that felt freer than any in years. Days passed, ordinary in rhythm, yet transformed in weight. They walked bridges together, her gait steadier each morning, his presence beside her no longer a shield but a companion. They worked in the hydroponics bay, her observations sharpening, his praise simple and unembellished, but more valuable than any currency she had ever known. In the market, she picked bread and fabric with her own hands, no longer shrinking beneath the gaze of others. Whispers still trailed them, but Darien never flinched, and slowly, she found herself walking taller, daring to believe they no longer mattered. One evening, as the rain returned and the city lights shimmered like molten glass on the wet surfaces outside, Sarai leaned against the balcony rail, her copper hair lifted by the cool draft. She looked down at the plaza far below, the place where 7 buyers had dismissed her with a word, and realized the weight of their judgment no longer clung. Behind her, Darien stepped out with 2 mugs of coffee, setting one within her reach. "You're quiet," he said, his voice carrying only observation. She turned to him, a faint smile breaking across her lips. Quiet, not broken. His eyes held hers, and for the first time she saw not evaluation, not calculation, but recognition. He nodded once. Different kind of quiet. I like it. She reached for the mug, fingers brushing his hand, and in that simple touch lay the truth of everything she had gained. Not rescue, not ownership, not obligation. Choice, her choice mirrored by his. And as the city pulsed indifferent beyond the glass, Sarai understood the final truth. She was not what they had named her. She was whole, and she was wanted not as property, but as herself. In that certainty, in that fragile and fierce revelation, she felt the last shadow of the word broken dissolve. And for the first time, she could imagine tomorrow not as survival, but as life. The sky over Ilaro's spire burned pale gold the following week, sunlight cutting across the mirrored towers until every surface shimmered like fire. From the balcony of Darienne's unit, Sarai stood with her hands braced against the rail, the city sprawling beneath her in its relentless rhythm. The plaza lay visible far below, the same stage where she had once stood exposed, rejected 7 times, her limp and her silence labeled a flaw. She stared at it now, her copper hair stirred by the wind, and felt no weight in her chest, no sting at the memory. It was there, yes, but distant like a wound that had closed into scar tissue, no longer defining her. Behind her, the sound of routine filled the room. Darien moving with his quiet precision, boots laced, tablet checked, coffee steaming. The domestic cadence of his life had become hers as well, not forced, not borrowed, but chosen. When he stepped out onto the balcony and set a mug near her hand, she looked at him, and for the first time, the words she had once feared rose easily. "I'm not afraid anymore." Darien studied her, his gaze steady, not probing. "Because you trust me?" he asked. She shook her head, a faint smile curving her mouth. "Because I trust myself." He nodded once, acceptance playing in his face. "Good, that's how it should be." They stood in silence, sipping bitter coffee as the city roared beneath them. And for the first time she felt as if she was standing above it, not beneath its judgment. Later, they walked the sky bridge together, her stride strong, even with the old injury taped and supported. His presence beside her, as constant as the pulse of the pumps in the hydroponics bay. People glanced. Of course, they always did when a human walked with someone not his own kind. But this time, Sarai lifted her chin. Her new slate blue shirt neat against her frame, her jacket buttoned, her eyes meeting theirs without flinching. No whispers cut her open. No stare pinned her in place. She walked as she wished to be seen. When they reached the bay, Darien placed the scanner in her hand without explanation, as if it belonged there. She moved down the aisles, reading values, naming flow rates, pointing out a leaf that drooped unevenly, and when Darien confirmed her observation with a brief nod and a quiet, "You caught that quicker than I did," her chest filled with something she had never known before, pride without fear. That evening, rain returned, streaking silver down the glass. The city lights refracted into endless rivers of color. They ate together in quiet, root stew steaming between them, bread broken into small pieces on the table. Sarai watched him, the man who had stepped forward when no one else had, who had bought her with no terms, no demands, and realized she no longer wondered what he wanted. She knew now. He wanted her not for silence or service, not for display or pity, but simply as herself. The thought pressed tears to her eyes, sharp and unexpected. She wiped them quickly, embarrassed, but Darien only reached across the table and set his rough hand over hers. His voice was low, certain. "You are never broken. They only wanted you to believe it." Sarai's throat tightened, but she managed the words anyway. "Then what am I?" He leaned closer, his eyes holding hers, steady as always. "You're the first one I couldn't leave behind. Not because you needed saving, because I did." The confession hit harder than any promise could have. She saw it then, the weight behind his routines, the scars in his steadiness, the way his certainty was built on years of carrying others, until his own soul had nearly fractured. He had chosen her, yes, but in choosing, he had given himself permission to stop carrying alone. Her breath shuddered, and she squeezed his hand tight, not with fear, but with recognition. That night they lay together as rain drummed soft against the balcony glass, the city beyond indifferent as ever. But inside the small unit, within the walls lined with quiet order, Sarai felt the last of her old identity dissolve. She was not the girl displayed and rejected, not the silent figure marked defective. She was Sarai, whole and chosen, walking beside a man who wanted her not as burden, not as property, but as partner. And in that certainty, in the quiet warmth of his arms, she understood the final truth. She had never been broken at all. She had only been waiting for someone steady enough to stand beside, and for herself to believe.